Caroline Harcourt was gentle 5'5", soft auburn hair plaited at the nape under a small lace cap, warm hazel eyes the colour of Derbyshire honey, fair Peak District complexion, in unrelieved black mourning gabardine for her late great-aunt the testatrix. She stood at the geological cabinet at the south parlour of the Bakewell parsonage, cataloguing a carboniferous limestone brachiopod lately gathered at the Friday before walk on the Castleton Mam Tor escarpment. The parsonage boy with the Derbyshire post knocked twice at the south door. Caroline set the brachiopod gentle at the velvet specimen tray at her right hand. She took the letter at the boy's hand. The crimson wafer seal held the cipher of Mr. Bakewell Smith, solicitor of Friargate, Derby. She broke the seal at her ungloved hand. The first 4 lines, that her late great-aunt Mrs. Theodora Mary Harcourt of Harcourt Hall, in the parish of Harcourt by Bakewell, had died Monday the 8th of December, last in the 71st year of her age, and that by the will lately proved at the Derby Prerogative Court, Mrs. Harcourt had named her great-niece Miss Caroline sole heiress. Mrs. Hathersage, the parsonage maid, came at the parlour door with the breakfast tray. At the wafer she observed in gentle Derbyshire worry that surely Miss Caroline shall faint, that the estate-keeping at Harcourt Hall was no work for a curate's daughter, and that Sir Felix Eddingham of Eddingham Hall near Derby shall have the estate by Lady Day, if she did not lay out the matter at once at Mr. Bakewell Smith of Friargate. Eddingham shall have it, she said again. Caroline did not answer. At the geological cabinet, the 47 catalogued Derbyshire specimens stood at the small mahogany trays, the Castleton lead galena, the Treetcliffe blue John fluorite, the Coal Measures plant impressions, the mountain limestone corals, the Millstone grit cross-bedded fragment. At the south sash, Mr. William Smith's 1815, a delineation of the strata of England and Wales, lay open at the carboniferous limestone section at the small reading stand. At the left of the geological cabinet, Mr. James Hutton's 1795 Theory of the Earth stood at the oak shelf at its 2 octavo volumes. The crimson wafer had a Derby weight at her ungloved hand. The December Peak District morning came soft and cool at the south sash. Through the open south door, the fresh sage kept the gentle parsonage smell of early winter. The pale yellow Derbyshire light held the brachiopod at the velvet tray. Caroline did not argue. She took up the small brass caliper at the cabinet's brass tray, set it gentle at the brachiopod's hinge, measured the shell at 3 1/4 inches at the cardinal margin, measured it at 2 3/4 inches at the median rib, and laid the caliper at the velvet tray. She crossed to the green calf geology journal at the writing table, took up the quill, and wrote Productus Giganteus, Carboniferous Limestone Brachiopod, Mam Tor Escarpment, Castleton. Friday, December 17th, 1819. Finished at Bakewell Parsonage, South Parlour, Wednesday, December 22nd, the Derbyshire Post at 10:30. She blotted the page and read the letter through. What was Sir Felix's claim? Named only as a paper requiring the Prerogative Court's notice at the Tuesday following Chambers, reading at Derby, and would the geological cataloguing work continue at Harcourt Hall at all? Mrs. Hathersage had set the breakfast tray at the parlour table. Caroline took up the parsonage tea, ate the small portion of seed cake, and at the close of the cup, wrote at the second sheet a short note at Mr. Bakewell Smith of Friargate, Derby. She accepted the appointed day at the Chambers, reading at Wednesday the 5th of January 1820, named the Bakewell Derby chaise at the Tuesday previous, and asked that the Chambers should be at her father's company at the appointed hour. She sealed the note at the small Harcourt parsonage seal her father kept at the west study, and gave it at Mrs. Hathersage for the Derbyshire Post the following morning. The pale yellow Derbyshire light at the south sash held the parsonage south parlour at the close of the morning, and Mrs. Hathersage at the hall door said in her gentle Derbyshire worry, one further time, that Eddingham shall have it by Lady Day, and went out at the hall to the parsonage kitchen. At the close of the December afternoon, Caroline took up the brachiopod, careful at her ungloved hand, and set it at the 7th tray of the geological cabinet at the labelled brass, Productus Giganteus, Mam Tor, Castleton, December 1819. She closed the cabinet at the small brass turnkey her father kept at the west study, set the caliper at the brass tray at the cabinet's head, laid the green calf journal at the writing table beside the letter and the second sealed note, and stood at the south sash a moment at the gentle pale yellow Derbyshire light. The Castleton brachiopod was 340 million years at the velvet tray, and the Derbyshire post had been at the parsonage south door at 10:30. Caroline did not at the south sash set out the matter at any further turn of her mind, and at the close of the south parlour light she went out at the hall to the parsonage kitchen at her father's company at the curate's plain supper. Wednesday the 5th of January, 1820. The Derby morning came down Friar Gate in plain January light, and the spire of St. Werburgh's stood at the north under a soft pewter Derbyshire sky. A thin Peak District frost had laid itself over the cobbles before the daylight had risen, and the iron railings at Mr. Bakewell Smith's chambers at No. 9 still held the silver of it. The Bakewell Derby chaise had set Caroline and Reverend Hadrian Harcourt down at the Bell at Sadler Gate at the gentle Derby hour the Tuesday evening previous, and the Bell's plain Derbyshire breakfast had been at the South Coffee Room at the morning of the Chambers reading. Reverend Hadrian had taken at the Bell the plain Peak District silence of a curate whose only daughter had been at no Derby chambers before, and shall not at the first Derby chambers be set at any speaking out of the Derbyshire post. Mr. Bakewell Smith was 60, gold spectacles, plain dark Derby wool. He received the Harcourts at the Chambers Hall, and led them through at the South Chambers at the long writing table at the Friar Gate window. The Chambers clerk, Mr. Tideswell Derby, small, plain, in a careful Derby coat of dark grey, had laid out the will, the inventory, the schedule of the South Library, the Chambers ink, and the small pewter ceiling set at the South writing table. Mr. Bakewell Smith bowed Reverend Hadrian to the south armchair at the Chambers fire, bowed Miss Harcourt to the south chair at the long writing table, took up his gold spectacles to the nose, and said in his settled Derby manner that the late Mrs. Harcourt of Harcourt Hall had asked at her own particular instruction that he should read the will aloud at the Harcourt's hearing at the Chambers reading of the day appointed. He took up the will at the head of the writing table. 6 pages in Mr. Tideswell Derby's plain Chambers hand, the small Derby consistory stamp at the head, the careful red ribbon at the seal. He read, "In the name of God, Amen. I, Theodora Mary Harcourt, widow, of Harcourt Hall in the parish of Harcourt by Bakewell, in the county of Derby, in the 71st year of my age, being of sound mind, memory, and understanding, praise be therefore given to Almighty God. Do make and publish this, my last will and testament in manner and form, following. First, I commit my soul to Almighty God, who gave it me, and my body to the parish ground of St. Mary's of Harcourt by Bakewell, at the south wall beside my late husband, Sir Augustus Harcourt, the 3rd Baronet. The burial to be at the plain Derbyshire manor the Reverend Tideswell shall appoint, and at no further charge of mourning at the parish than the parish customary. Second, I give, devise, and bequeath unto my great niece Miss Caroline Mary Harcourt of the Bakewell parsonage, only child of my late niece Mrs. Augusta Mary Harcourt, née Bakewell Y, and of the Reverend Hadrian Harcourt, her widowed husband, curate of All Saints of Bakewell, all that my manor of Harcourt Hall, with the Messuage and the South Manor House, and the 158 acres of home pasture at the Carboniferous Limestone Peak District Sheep Walk, the walled South Garden with the fossil display pavilion at the south wall, the Apple Orchard at the east, the South Library of 384 volumes, the Harcourt family plate of 82 pieces at the Derby 1789 mark, the sum of £3,300 sterling at the 3% consolidated stock, my own bound rock cabinet ledgers of 1784 through 1819 at the South Library writing table, the Smith correspondence bundle at the South Library cabinet, and Mr. John Whitehurst's 1778 inquiry into the original state and formation of the earth at the South Library shelf, all to her sole and separate use, and to her heirs and assigns forever. Third, I give and bequeath unto Mrs. Marjorie Castleton, my housekeeper at Harcourt Hall, these 26 years past, the sum of £100 sterling, and the small Derbyshire parlour clock at the housekeeper's room, in gentle acknowledgment of her settled keeping. Fourth, I give and bequeath unto Mr. Walter Edale, my steward at Harcourt Hall, these 22 years past, the sum of £100 sterling, and the small Bakewell Bay mare at the East Stable, in careful acknowledgment of his settled keeping. Fifth, I give and bequeath unto the Reverend Mortimer Tideswell, curate of St. Mary's of Harcourt by Bakewell, these 13 years past, the sum of £50 sterling, and the small Derby folio of Hooker's Ecclesiastical Polity, 1666, at the South Library, in careful acknowledgment of his parish keeping. Sixth and last, I nominate and appoint Mr. Septimus Bakewell Smith, of Friargate, Derby, solicitor, sole executor of this my last will and testament, with the full authority of the prerogative court at Derby, in witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand and seal at Harcourt Hall, in the parish of Harcourt by Bakewell, in the county of Derby, this 4th day of November, in the year of our Lord, 1819. Theodora Mary Harcourt, witnessed, the Reverend Mortimer Tideswell, curate of St. Mary's of Harcourt by Bakewell, Mr. Walter Edale, steward of Harcourt Hall. Mr. Bakewell Smith laid the will at the writing table at Caroline's hand and was silent. Reverend Hadrian Harcourt, at the south armchair, said nothing. He had taken at the chamber's fire the plain Derbyshire silence of a curate who has heard a thing at the prerogative court reading, and shall not at the first hearing set it down in any other manner. Caroline read the will over once at her own hand, at the plain Derby daylight from the Friargate window, folded it at its first crease, and laid it at the chamber's writing table. Mr. Bakewell Smith then drew up from the chamber's dispatch case the 6 items the will had appointed. The first was the copy of the will itself, at Mr. Tideswell Derby's plain chamber's hand, 6 pages, the schedule of the 158 acres of Carboniferous limestone sheep walk, and the walled south garden and the apple orchard, and the South Library of 384 volumes, and the family plate of 82 pieces at the Derby 1789 mark, the £3,300 in the 3%, the 4 servants and the parish curate and the executor. Mr. Bakewell Smith laid it at the chamber's writing table at her hand. The second was a brass ring of 5 keys at a plain length of black ribbon, the south door of Harcourt Hall, the South Library, the muniment room at the west, the plate chest at the east, and the walled south garden gate. Mr. Bakewell Smith laid the ring at the chamber's writing table, and the brass at the January daylight had the dull, warm tone of plate that has been at a Derbyshire housekeeper's, keeping these 26 years. The third was a banker's draft at Smith Payne and Smith's of Lombard Street for £3,300 sterling, drawn at the 3% stock, and made out at the order of Miss Caroline Mary Harcourt, of the Bakewell Parsonage, Derbyshire, dated the 2nd of January 1820, countersigned at the Derby branch the Monday previous. Mr. Bakewell Smith laid it at the chamber's writing table. The fourth was the calling card of Reverend Mortimer Tideswell, curate of St. Mary's of Harcourt by Bakewell, with at the verso a written line in his plain Derbyshire hand, I shall wait at the south door of Harcourt Hall at Miss Harcourt's arrival. M.T. Mr. Bakewell Smith laid it at the Chambers writing table. The 5th was the calling card of Lord Marmaduke Aubrey Sherborne, 5th Viscount Sherborne of Sherborne Park, lay patron of the Harcourt by Bakewell living, with at the verso a written line in his plain hand. At Miss Harcourt's settled time. Sherborne. Mr. Bakewell Smith laid it at the Chambers writing table. The 6th was a second sealed letter. The wax again the small Harcourt cipher of Mrs. Theodora's hand, and the 3 Harcourt sprigs of oak, the direction at the face in Mrs. Theodora Harcourt's own settled writing, to the Reverend Hadrian Harcourt, curate of All Saints of Bakewell, at the parsonage, at the proper time after Mr. Bakewell Smith's reading. Mr. Bakewell Smith laid the sealed letter at Reverend Hadrian's hand at the south armchair. The 6 items lay at the Chambers writing table at the Friar Gate January daylight. The will at the head, the brass ring of 5 keys at the black ribbon, the £3,300 draft at Smith Payne and Smith's, the calling card of Reverend Tideswell, the calling card of Lord Sherborne, and the second sealed mourning letter at her father's hand. Mr. Bakewell Smith took off the gold spectacles, laid them at the writing table, and at his settled Derby manner set out one further matter at the Chambers reading. Sir Felix Eddingham of Eddingham Hall, near Derby, had lodged at the Derby Prerogative Court the Friday of the 31st of December last, only 5 days previous, said Mr. Bakewell Smith in his careful Derby manner. A folded paper claiming a parole trust of the September of 1818 over the south half of Harcourt Hall. The paper named a private interview at the South Library at Harcourt Hall at the afternoon of the 14th of September, 1818, at which Mrs. Theodora Harcourt had, at Sir Felix's stated account, set out the matter of a settled trust at her own hand at the rock cabinet she had then been cataloguing at the South Library. The fossil was named in Sir Felix's paper as a Derbyshire specimen lately gathered at the Castleton cave system, though Sir Felix's paper did not at the Prerogative Court set out the species at the first lodging. The matter shall require interview at Harcourt Hall at the Wednesday following Miss Harcourt's arrival, with Mr. Whitehurst Derby, Sir Felix's barrister at the matter, and Mr. Bakewell Smith shall come down at the Derby chaise at the appointed day in his own settled Chambers company. He set the matter at the close of the reading at the plain Derby manner of a solicitor who shall name a thing at the table without setting it at the table's weight. Mr. Bakewell Smith then said his settled Derby instruction. The Chambers should be at Miss Harcourt's command at any morning of the 12th night week. If she would write at the Monday following her acceptance at the will and her appointed day at the arrival at Harcourt Hall, he should send word at Mrs. Castleton, and at Mr. Buxton, and at Mr. Edale, and at Reverend Tideswell. The 5 keys would then be at her hand at the south door of Harcourt Hall at the appointed day. He drank the careful Derby tea, Mr. Tideswell. Derby had sat at the Chambers fire, ate a plain Derbyshire biscuit at the Chambers plate, and at the close of his second cup, took his leave at the Chambers Hall. Reverend Hadrian saw him at the Friar Gate, south door. The Harcourts took the short Derby walk south to the Bell at Sadler Gate, ate a careful plain Derby dinner at the South Coffee Room, and at the close of the afternoon took the Bakewell Derby chaise at the Chambers' appointed manner. The chaise set them down at the Rutland Arms at Bakewell at the gentle Derbyshire hour, and the parsonage gig had carried them at the half-mile at the close of the evening to the Bakewell parsonage south door. At the parsonage south parlour, Reverend Hadrian Harcourt set the candle at the writing table, drew the small black silk ribbon at his cassock pocket, took up Mrs. Theodora's sealed morning letter at her own settled Harcourt hand, set the letter at the parlour writing table, took up the silver paper knife at the chimney-piece, and broke the wafer seal. He stood at the south sash and read in plain Derbyshire silence. Caroline sat at the parlour chair at the south window, and did not look at his father's face. The candle at the chimney-piece took the small amber light of the parsonage tallow. The brass ring of 5 keys at the black ribbon lay at the writing table beside the will, the £3,300 draft, the 2 calling cards, and the closed green calf geology journal, and at the south sash, the January Derbyshire night came on at the parsonage south garden in the plain manner of a Peak District winter. At the close of the reading, her father folded Mrs. Theodora's letter, laid it at his cassock pocket, set his hand once at her shoulder, and went out at the parlour door to the west study without a word. Caroline did not ask him at the matter of the letter. She sat at the south window a long while at the chimney-piece candle and the green calf geology journal at the writing table, and at the close of the evening she rose, took the parsonage candle at her hand, and went up the parsonage stair at the south door of her own chamber in the plain Bakewell manner of a curate's daughter at the close of a long Derbyshire day. The Thursday following, the 6th of January 1820, Caroline sat at the parsonage writing table at the south parlour, and at her own plain hand wrote at Mr. Bakewell Smith of Friar Gate, Derby. She accepted the bequest at the will, accepted the appointment at the 6 items, named her appointed day at the arrival at Harcourt Hall at Saturday the 8th of January 1820, and asked that he should at the Derby post Friday send word at Mrs. Castleton the housekeeper, and at Mr. Buxton the butler, and at Mr. Edale the steward, and at Reverend Tideswell the parish curate. She signed the letter Caroline Mary Harcourt at the parsonage of Bakewell, sealed it at the small Harcourt parsonage seal her father kept at the west study, and sent it at the Derby post that afternoon at the parsonage buoy. She wrote at the second sheet a short note at Reverend Tideswell at the parish living of Harcourt by Bakewell. In the plain Derbyshire hand, the parish curate would know at the first glance that she should be at Harcourt Hall the Saturday the 8th of January 1820, and that she should be at St. Mary's of Harcourt by Bakewell the Sunday the 9th of January 1820 at his parish service. She sealed it at the same small Harcourt seal and sent it at the same Derby post. She wrote at the third sheet a careful note at Lord Sherborne at Sherborne Park, Derbyshire. In the plain hand, the lay patron of the parish living was owed at his calling card, to say that she had received at her hand his lay patron card at the chambers, reading at Derby, and that she should be at Harcourt Hall the Saturday the 8th of January 1820, in her late great-aunt's appointed manner. She did not say more. She sealed it at the same small Harcourt seal, and sent it at the same Derby post. At the close of the Friday afternoon, Caroline went to the parlour writing table at the geological cabinet. She set the 3 Tunbridge-bound geological notebooks of 1815 to 1817, 1817 to 1818, and 1818 to 1819 at the small cedar travelling box the parsonage kept at the west study. Set Mr. Smith's 1815A delineation of the strata of England and Wales, and Mr. Hutton's 1795 theory of the earth at the box beside them. Set the green calf geology journal at the head of the box, and set the small brass caliper and the small Derbyshire specimen pouches and the small lead pencils at the body. The 7th tray of the geological cabinet, the Castleton brachiopod, the Treak Cliff Blue John, the mountain limestone coral, the millstone grit fragment, she lifted careful at her ungloved hand, wrapped each at the small Derbyshire flannel the parsonage kept at the west study, and laid them at the small cedar travelling portfolio at the head of the box. The geological notebooks she packed first, before the small Derbyshire gowns the parsonage kept for her at the chamber press, before the small Harcourt household linen, before the parsonage prayer book. The notebooks at the box, the Smith and Hutton volumes at the box, the green calf journal at the box. These went at the cedar travelling box at the west study at the head of the parsonage packing list. The plain Derbyshire gowns and the small parsonage household linen and the parsonage prayer book went at the second box. At the small drawer beneath the south parlour writing table, she found the 4 letters of Mr. William Smith of Marsham Street, London, to her own hand of the Lady Days of 1816 through 1819, and she laid them at the cedar portfolio beside the wrapped Castleton specimens. She did not yet know whether Mrs. Theodora Harcourt's own Smith correspondence bundle at the South Library cabinet at Harcourt Hall should be at the same Mr. Smith's hand, but the matter was at the Saturday following, and not at the parsonage writing table. Mrs. Hathersage came down at the parlour with the second tray, and said at the gentle worry of the parsonage maid, "One further time that Eddingham shall have it by Lady Day, if Miss Caroline did not answer Sir Felix at the chambers manner Mr. Bakewell Smith had laid out at the Friar Gate." Caroline did not answer. She set the cedar travelling box at the south door beside the second box, set the brass ring of 5 keys at the parlour writing table beside the £3,300 draft and the 2 calling cards and the closed green calf geology journal, and at the close of the January afternoon stood at the south sash, a moment in the plain, Bakewell's silence of a parsonage curate's daughter, at a packing list the parsonage had not at her 28 years before set out. The Bakewell parsonage south parlour at the close of the afternoon held the cedar smell of a parsonage west study packing list, and at the south sash the January Derbyshire night came on at the parsonage south garden in the Plain Peak district manor. Caroline set the candle at the writing table at the green calf geology journal, and at the parsonage south parlour silence the brass ring of 5 keys at the black ribbon lay at the writing table at her hand. Saturday the 8th of January, in the year 1820, came in upon the Derbyshire Peak District at a pale flax-grey sky, a thin frost rime upon the millstone grit walls at the lane to the Bakewell parsonage, and a gentle wood smoke at the chimney of the south parlour, where Caroline Harcourt had passed her last breakfast at the table where she had taken every breakfast since she was a girl of 11. The widowed Reverend Hadrian Harcourt sat at the head with the Derbyshire newspaper folded at his elbow, and a small dish of marmalade at his hand. And he did not speak much because Caroline did not speak much, and the silence between them was the silence of 2 people who had spent a lifetime in the same rooms and did not need the comfort of words to know what the other was thinking. Mrs. Hathersage had laid out the portmanteau and the geology journal and the brass caliper at the hall table, and the Bakewell postboy was come down at the door with the small farm cart that Mr. Edale, the Harcourt steward, had sent across the country from Harcourt Hall at the first light of that Saturday morning for the carriage of Caroline's portmanteau and her geological specimens. Caroline went up to the south parlour a last time. The geological cabinet stood at the south wall as it had stood these 7 years, the 47 Derbyshire specimens at their velvet trays, the Productus Giganteus of the Friday before walk at the Castleton Mamtor escarpment lately set out at the topmost tray, the Carboniferous corals at the second, the crinoid stems at the third. And she touched the glazed door at the brass knob a moment and did not open it, because the cabinet would come down at the farm cart at the second journey at the afternoon, and she'd set the order at Mrs. Hathersage at the breakfast hour. She came down. Her father stood at the parsonage hall in his curate's black coat. He kissed her at the brow once, and he said only that he should expect her at the Sunday dinner, the Sunday following at the parsonage if the Derbyshire weather held, and Caroline said that she should come, and that was all the leave-taking that was wanted between the curate and his daughter for the 3-mile country between Bakewell and Harcourt by Bakewell. The post-chaise was the small one-horse fly from the yard of the Rutland Arms at Bakewell, a local short hop of 3 miles north up the country lane along the Derbyshire Wye to the parish of Harcourt by Bakewell. No proper post-stage, no change of horses, no inn upon the road between. The single-hired conveyance carried Caroline at the gentle pace of a Derbyshire winter morning out at the north gate of Bakewell, across the stone bridge of the Wye, and up the lane at the south slope of the Carboniferous limestone outcrop that ran along the east side of the river for the full 3 miles north to the gates of Harcourt Hall, the fly arriving at the south drive at the close of the morning. The south door of Harcourt Hall opened upon a flagged hall of Derbyshire millstone grit, and a tall mullioned window that looked out at the south meadow above the Wye, and Mr. Buxton the butler bowed once at the threshold and said in a plain Derbyshire gravity that Harcourt Hall was Miss Harcourt's at her command. Mrs. Castleton, the housekeeper, in her lace cap and her plum bombazine, came forward at the inner step and curtsied gentle and said that the south library fire had been laid at first light, and that the south bedchamber above the south library had been aired the 3 days following the funeral against Miss Harcourt's coming. Mr. Edale the steward, weathered at the cheek from 40 Derbyshire winters at the home pasture, took his plain dark hat at the hand and said that the rent book and the steward's accounts lay at the south library table at Miss Harcourt's pleasure whensoever she should be inclined to take them up. Mr. Edale brought down the inventory at the south library table after Caroline had taken a cup of tea at the south parlour and had walked the south passage at Mrs. Castleton's gentle pace. 158 acres of home pasture and orchard and walled south garden, 384 volumes at the south library shelves, catalogued at Mrs. Theodora's hand, in a Derbyshire-bound ledger of 1808, 82 pieces of plate at the Derby assay of 1789, set down at the strong-room at the basement under the housekeeper's key, and £3,300 at the 3 per cents at Smith, Payne and Smith at London, standing at Caroline's name from the Tuesday following, the Prerogative Court's grant of probate, with the rent roll of the home pasture and the 4 cottage tenancies at the parish of Harcourt by Bakewell, standing at £480, the year clear of the land tax and the parish rates. Caroline went out at the south door at the close of the noon hour. The Derbyshire Wye ran along the foot of the south meadow at the low winter water, a pale silver ribbon at the pale flax-grey sky, gentle at the bend below the apple orchard at the east. The Carboniferous limestone outcrop rose at the south slope above the meadow in 2 grey terraces of weathered mountain limestone, the rock face pocked at the small caves of the Derbyshire country, and patched at the dark green of winter ivy at the lower courses, and the manor itself at her back was a Derbyshire millstone grit house of 1750, 2 stories, a slate roof at the steep pitch of the Peak District winters, 3 brick chimneys at the ridge, stone-mullioned south windows at the ground, and the upper floor, the south front, the warm honey grey of 70 years of Derbyshire weather. She stood a long minute at the south meadow gate, looking at it all, and she did not speak. She went into the south library at the close of the afternoon. The room ran the full length of the south front of the manor, a long warm room of millstone grit chimney-piece at the west wall, oak shelves at the north and east walls bearing the 384 volumes of Mrs. Theodora's library, 2 long oak tables at the south windows for the laying out of specimens and the spreading of maps, and at the southwest corner under the deep mullioned window stood a tall walnut cabinet of 12 shallow drawers that Caroline had not seen at her last visit to Harcourt Hall in the August of 1818, because Mrs. Theodora had been at Buxton at the Waters at that fortnight, and the south library had been kept locked. Caroline drew the topmost drawer at the small brass handle. Beneath a tissue of plain white paper lay 9 catalogued specimens of Carboniferous limestone brachiopods at small numbered velvet trays, each set out at a copper plate label in Mrs. Theodora's hand, bearing the species and the Derbyshire locality and the date of gathering, the topmost label dated June 11th, 1784, at Castleton, the lowest at the same drawer, dated September 23rd, 1819, at Wirksworth, and at the south end of the cabinet, upon a small reading shelf, there lay a quarto ledger, bound in dark green calf and lettered at the spine, Harcourt Rock Cabinet, 1784 to 1819, 387 catalogued Derbyshire Carboniferous specimens at Mrs. Theodora's own hand across the 35 years of her widowhood, and beside the ledger, a small black leather portfolio tied at red tape bearing at the cover in the same copper plate the words Mr. W. Smith, Marsham Street, Correspondence 1815 to 1819. Caroline sat down at the south oak table at the cabinet. She untied the red tape gentle. The portfolio held 14 letters of Mr. William Smith, the geologist of Marsham Street, London. The first dated March 4th, 1815 at the publication of the delineation of the strata of England and Wales. The last dated May 14th, 1819 at the close of Mr. Smith's debtor's troubles. And at the third letter, Caroline read at the careful copper plate of Mr. Smith's own hand the gentle words of a London geologist to a Derbyshire widow upon the proper stratigraphic confinement of the carboniferous brachiopods of the mountain limestone at the Peak District country. She closed the portfolio at her hand and set it at the table at the cabinet, and she did not speak, because there was nothing at that quiet south library at the close of a Derbyshire January afternoon that wanted speaking. The rock cabinet and the Smith correspondence had been laid down at the south library by Mrs. Theodora, across 35 years, for the next Harcourt who should know the carboniferous limestone of the Peak District at her own hand, and Caroline Harcourt was that next Harcourt. Mrs. Castleton came in at the south library door at the gentle approach of the dinner hour, bearing at her hand a small calf-bound volume tied at black ribbon, and she said in her quiet Derbyshire voice that the commonplace book of Mrs. Theodora Harcourt had been set down at the housekeeper's room at the Tuesday following the funeral against Miss Harcourt's coming, and she set the volume at the corner of the south oak table and curtsied gentle and went out. The Sunday following, the 9th of January, 1820, Caroline walked the half-mile across the south meadow and along the lane at the foot of the carboniferous outcrop to the small parish church of St. Mary's of Harcourt by Bakewell, at the gentle company of Mrs. Castleton, and the Reverend Tideswell at his plain black gown, read the morning service at the small mullioned chancel before a congregation of 7 Harcourt tenants and 4 village families, and Caroline at the front, Harcourt pew, with her gloved hands at the prayer book and her warm hazel eyes at the small east window of clear Derbyshire glass. The Monday and the Tuesday came in at the gentle pace of a Derbyshire winter at Harcourt Hall, Caroline at the South Library at the Rock Cabinet, drawing out the 12 drawers one at a time and reading the 387 entries of Mrs. Theodora's ledger at the long oak table by the south window. Caroline at the South Meadow Gate at the afternoons with the Greencalf Geology Journal at her hand, sketching the 2 terraces of the carboniferous limestone outcrop above the Y. Caroline at the South Parlour at the evening reading the commonplace book at the small fire. The entries gentle and short, the script close, the years from 1782, the year of Mrs. Theodora's marriage to Sir Augustus, to the November of 1819, the month before her death. Mrs. Castleton at the housekeeper's bell, Mr. Buxton at the south door, Mr. Edale at the steward's office at the back court, the household at Harcourt Hall, settling at the new mistress at the gentle measure of a Peak District country house. At the Monday morning, Caroline drew out the 3rd drawer of the walnut cabinet and read it through. The drawer held 34 carboniferous corals at the small numbered velvet trays, Lithostrosian Martini at the first locality of Wirksworth at the May of 1796, Syringapora geniculata at the second locality of Castleton at the August of 1801, Caninia cylindrica at the third locality of Monash at the June of 1808, and at the back of the drawer the small label in Mrs. Theodora's careful copper plate, setting out the proper stratigraphic placement of every coral at the Derbyshire mountain limestone of the Mississippian sub-period of the Carboniferous, dated and signed and witnessed at Mr. Smith's London correspondence of the March of 1816. Caroline read the 34 entries at the ledger against the 34 velvet trays at the drawer, and found the cross-references stand at every line, and she set the drawer back at the cabinet at the small, steady pressure of her ungloved hand, and did not speak. The 4th drawer she opened at the close of the Monday morning held the crinoid stems of the Derbyshire Y gorge, gathered at the summer afternoons of the years 1786 to 1819, and the 5th drawer held the bryozoans of the Castleton lead mining outcrops, and the 6th drawer held the gastropods of the Wirksworth quarries, and at every drawer Mrs. Theodora's hand had set out the carboniferous limestone of the Peak District at the patient 35 years of a widow's stratigraphy. There was no trilobite at any drawer at the walnut cabinet of the southwest corner of the South Library at Harcourt Hall. There was no Silurian species at any tray. There was no Wenlock limestone at any locality. Mrs. Theodora's 387 Derbyshire specimens were a carboniferous record only, and Caroline read it through at the Monday morning and the Monday afternoon and the Tuesday morning at the South Oak table, and knew it down to the smallest velvet tray at the lowest drawer. At the Tuesday afternoon, Caroline took out the 14 letters of the black leather portfolio at the small reading shelf of the walnut cabinet, and read them at the South Oak table by the pale Derbyshire light at the South Mullion. Mr. Smith's first letter of the March of 1815 set down the gentle congratulations of the London geologist upon Mrs. Theodora's standing wish of a fossil display pavilion at the south wall of the walled South Garden. The second letter of the August of 1815 set down the proper stratigraphic placement of the Derbyshire mountain limestone at the Mississippian subperiod. The third letter set down the brachiopod fauna of the Castleton outcrops. The 4th letter set down the coral fauna of the Wirksworth quarries. The 5th letter set down the crinoid fauna of the Derbyshire Y gorge, and the 6th letter, dated May 14th, 1819 at Marsham Street, London, set down at the careful copperplate of Mr. Smith's own hand the gentle and final words upon the stratigraphic confinement of the trilobites of Calamine at the Wenlock limestone of the Welsh Marches, and the proper Derbyshire confinement of Mrs. Theodora's Harcourt Hall collection at the carboniferous fauna of the mountain limestone. Caroline read the 6th letter through twice at the South Oak table at the Tuesday afternoon, and she did not speak. She set the letter back at the portfolio at the careful order of Mr. Smith's hand, and she tied the red tape at the small bow that Mrs. Theodora had tied at the May of 1819, and she set the portfolio back at the small reading shelf at the walnut cabinet, and she closed the glazed door at the small brass handle at her ungloved hand. The Wednesday came in at a pale frost-bound morning, the carboniferous limestone outcrop at the south slope, white at the rime, the Y at the foot of the meadow at the low winter water. Caroline was at the South Library, at the rock cabinet, at the second to topmost drawer, when Mr. Buxton tapped at the South Library door, and came in at her quiet word, and set down upon the South Oak table a small calling card upon a small silver salver, and bowed at the threshold, and withdrew. Caroline took up the card at her ungloved hand. The card was of stout cream pasteboard, the printer's plate of Derby, the name in plain copper plate, Sir Felix Eddingham, 4th Baronet, of Eddingham Hall, near Derby, and at the lower left corner, pencilled small at the gentleman's own hand, the words requests the honour of waiting upon Miss Harcourt at the South Library, at her Derbyshire convenience, upon a matter touching upon the late Mrs. Theodora Harcourt's intention of the September of 1818. Caroline set the card down at the South Oak table beside the rock cabinet ledger. She did not rise. She did not call for Mr. Buxton. She did not speak. The Derbyshire pale yellow January light came in at the South Mullion at the angle of the noon hour, and fell at the brass corner plates of the rock cabinet at her right hand. She read the pencilled words a second time at the gentle Derbyshire composure of a curate's daughter of 28, who had spent 35 hours at the South Library with Mrs. Theodora's 387 specimen rock cabinet and Mr. Smith's 14 letters from Marsham Street, and she did not feel the small startling at the heart that Mrs. Hathersage at Bakewell would have looked for, because Caroline Harcourt, at the South Library at Harcourt Hall, on the 12th of January 1820, had at her right hand the careful Derbyshire Carboniferous record of 35 years, that no September of 1818 visiting baronet could speak across, and she knew it. She took down at the small standish a sheet of plain Derbyshire writing paper at her ungloved hand. She wrote at her own gentle copperplate 3 lines to Mr. Bakewell Smith at Friargate, Derby, that the calling card of Sir Felix Edingham was lately come up at Harcourt Hall, that Caroline forwarded the same to Mr. Bakewell Smith's notice against Mr. Bakewell Smith's standing instructions of the Wednesday before at the Chambers reading, and that Caroline should await Mr. Bakewell Smith's gentle direction at the South Library at Harcourt Hall, against the receipt of Mr. Bakewell Smith's reply. She sealed the letter at a small plain Derbyshire wafer, and laid it at the South Oak table for Mr. Buxton at the next Derby post. She rose at the South Oak table and went to the south mullioned window, and looked out at the Carboniferous limestone outcrop at the south slope, white at the rime under the pale Derbyshire January sky, and she set her warm hazel gaze at the lower terrace of the mountain limestone, where the small grey caves opened at the rock face, and she did not speak. A Derbyshire crow at the apple orchard called once across the frost-bound meadow, and was answered at the upper terrace of the outcrop, and the small pale yellow January sun stood at the south mullion at the noon hour, at the angle that Mrs. Theodora had marked, at the South Library floorboards, at a brass pin set down in 1786, to take the meridian of the Peak District winter. The rock cabinet at the southwest corner of the South Library stood at her back at the gentle, steady weight of Mrs. Theodora's 35 Derbyshire years. The green calf ledger lay at the South Oak table at her hand. The black portfolio of Mr. Smith's correspondence lay at the small reading shelf at the cabinet, and the calling card of Sir Felix Edingham lay at the South Oak table beside them, at the gentle, pale yellow Derbyshire light of a Peak District noon hour. And Caroline Harcourt at the South Library at Harcourt Hall on the 12th of January 1820 had the Derbyshire stratigraphy of the Peak District at her own hand, and the patience of a curate's daughter at the front pew of St. Mary's of Harcourt by Bakewell. And that, at the South Library of Harcourt Hall, at the close of the first Derbyshire week of the new mistress, was the careful Derbyshire ground upon which the September of 1818 trilobite of Sir Felix Edingham should presently come to rest. Wednesday the 19th of January, 1820 came down at the Derbyshire Wye Valley, with a thin pale west wind at the Harcourt south slope, and a sky the colour of old pewter at the South Library window. Caroline Harcourt was at the South Library writing table at the south sash since the breakfast hour, her unrelieved black morning gabardine plain at the wrist, a small lace cap pinned at the auburn plait at the nape, the green calf geology journal open at her right hand, and the late Mrs. Theodora Harcourt's rock cabinet ledger of 1784 to 1819 laid out at the table before her. The matter of Sir Felix Edingham's calling card, dropped at the south porch on the Wednesday last, had been kept in the level Peak District fashion below stairs all the 7 days following, and the household was at the table without being asked. Mr. Buxton the butler was at the South Library door at his standing place. The Reverend Tideswell, the Harcourt parish curate, was at the South Library long bench at the window, his plain black gown brushed. Mr. Bakewell Smith of Friargate, Derby, had come up by the Bakewell post-chaise the evening before, and was at the long oak chair at the table, gold spectacles set at the nose, the Friargate Chambers ledger open at his left elbow. The carriage wheels at the south drive came at 20 minutes past 10. Caroline heard them at the south sash, and did not lift her head from the ledger at her hand. She set the small brass caliper at the green calf geology journal at the place she had been measuring, closed the rock cabinet ledger at the green silk ribbon Mrs. Theodora had tied it at, and laid it at the centre of the writing table at the south sash light. The Derbyshire specimen tray she had brought down from the bureau stood at her right elbow, the Productus Giganteus Brachiopod from the Mamtor Escarpment Walk of Friday the 17th of December, last still set at the lined velvet of the tray. Mr. William Smith's 1815. A delineation of the strata of England and Wales lay open at the writing table at the Derbyshire section. The small brass paperweight Mrs. Theodora had kept in the South Library, all her widowhood set at the open page. She knew her ground. Mr. Buxton had the south porch door open before the second knock had come at the brass plate. The footstep at the South Library door was heavy and slow. A Derby heel at the Peak District Oak. Mr. Buxton announced in the level Derbyshire fashion, Sir Felix Eddingham of Eddingham Hall, near Derby, and Mr. Whitehurst of the Derby Bar. Sir Felix Eddingham, 54, stout, 5 feet 10, gout-flushed, primrose silk waistcoat, oily smile, came in at the carriage step. Mr. Whitehurst, thin grey, charcoal wool, long buff brief roll under the arm, came in at the second step. Caroline rose, set her plain cream linen cloth at the Geology Journal, and gave the small civil curtsy her late mother had taught her at the Bakewell parsonage. Mr. Bakewell Smith rose. The Reverend Tideswell rose. Mr. Buxton set out 2 Peak District oak chairs at the table opposite Mr. Bakewell Smith and Caroline, and withdrew at the door without sound. Sir Felix bowed at the table in the fashion of a man who has set out to bow at a smaller party than the one in the room. The oily smile did not move at the mouth. He gave Caroline the Derby nod he kept for tenants' daughters at quarter-day. Mr. Whitehurst laid the long buff brief roll at his elbow, untied the green tape at the head of the roll, and drew out 3 folded papers. Mr. Bakewell Smith waited until Sir Felix and Mr. Whitehurst were both seated. Sir Felix, Mr. Whitehurst, the matter at this interview is the paper lodged by your party at the Derby Prerogative Court on the Tuesday the 11th of January last, claiming a parole trust of September 1818 over the south half of the Harcourt estate against the will of the late Mrs. Theodora Harcourt, dated the 4th of November 1819. Mr. Whitehurst, you may set out the claim. Mr. Whitehurst lifted the first folded paper at the table, opened it at the south sash light, set his Derby barrister's spectacles at the nose, and read out in the thin Derby voice of a man who has set out the same paper at the Derby Assize 3 times in the year past. By the leave of this interview at the South Library at Harcourt Hall, in the parish of Harcourt by Bakewell, in the county of Derby, on the Wednesday the 19th day of January, in the year of our Lord, 1820, my client, Sir Felix Eddingham, 4th Baronet Eddingham of Eddingham Hall, in the parish of Eddingham by Derby, doth claim of the said estate the south half thereof, by parole trust, given out by the late Mrs. Theodora Harcourt, widow, of Sir Augustus Harcourt, 3rd Baronet, at the South Library of the said Harcourt Hall, on the afternoon of Monday the 14th day of September, in the year of our Lord, 1818, in the matter of the south slope and the south pasture. The thin voice did not lift at the south sash. Sir Felix did not move. Mr. Whitehurst set the first paper at the table, lifted the second, and read on. The said parole trust was given out at a private interview at the South Library at Harcourt Hall at the afternoon of the said 14th day of September 1818, between the said Mrs. Theodora Harcourt, then in her 70th year, and the said Sir Felix Eddingham, then in his 52nd year, no third party being present at the said interview, save Mrs. Harcourt's own rock cabinet at the South Library, at which cabinet I, the said Sir Felix Eddingham, saw with my own eyes Mrs. Harcourt catalogue her specimen of Calamine Blumenbaschi, the trilobite, lately gathered by herself at the Castleton cave system on the cool September afternoon of the same day, the matter of the parole trust being discussed throughout the said interview between the said Mrs. Harcourt and myself, with the said trilobite at the rock cabinet at the South Library before us both. Mr. Bakewell-Smith did not write. The Reverend Tideswell did not move. Mr. Whitehurst set the second paper at the table and lifted the third. The said claim is therefore that the south half of the estate, the south slope of 78 acres, the south pasture of 42 acres, the south library and the fossil display pavilion at the south wall, are by the said parole trust of September 14th, 1818, the property of my client against the will of the said Mrs. Theodora Harcourt, dated the 4th of November, 1819, the parole trust being prior in time to the will by 1 year and 7 weeks, and being evidenced by the said trilobite and by my client's own oath at the said interview. The thin Derby voice stopped at the south sash. Mr. Whitehurst laid the third paper at the head of the buff brief roll. Sir Felix lifted his thin, oily mouth at the corner. Mr. Bakewell-Smith, the matter is plain. I saw the trilobite at the cabinet at the South Library with my own eyes at the afternoon of the said day. Mrs. Harcourt had gathered the fossil at the Castleton cave system at the morning of the same. The trilobite was set out at the velvet tray, still wet at the Castleton mud. We spoke of the south slope and of the south pasture throughout the interview. The south half is mine by the parole trust, given out at the rock cabinet. Caroline did not answer. She set her plain cream linen cloth at the green calf geology journal at her right hand and lifted her warm hazel eyes, the colour of Derbyshire honey, from the table to Sir Felix at the Peak District oak chair across the writing table. Sir Felix, she said in the level fashion her father had taught her at the Bakewell Parsonage South Parlour, I beg your leave to set out 3 matters at the South Library table before we close this interview, and to ask you to look at each in turn before you sign at Mr. Whitehurst's paper. Mr. Bakewell-Smith, may I have the leave of the interview to set out the 3 matters? Mr. Bakewell-Smith gave the small Derby nod he kept at chambers. Miss Harcourt, you have the leave of the interview. Caroline set her right hand at the rock cabinet ledger at the writing table, the green silk ribbon Mrs. Theodora had tied at the head of the foolscap bound ledger, and laid it open at the centre of the table at the south sashlight. The first matter is my late great-aunt, Mrs. Theodora Harcourt's own rock cabinet ledger of the years of our Lord, 1784 to 1819, kept at this South Library from her marriage at Sir Augustus Harcourt at Lady Day, 1784, to the Sunday the 5th of December, 1819, the day before her death, at this same library. The ledger is bound at foolscap quarto in the green calf my late great-aunt had at the Derby binder of Friar Gate. Mr. Bakewell-Smith has examined the ledger on the Monday the 17th of January last, and has set his Derby initials at the head of every leaf. Mr. Bakewell-Smith set out his Derby initials, BW-S, at the table for the room to see, and gave the small Derby nod again at the south sash. Sir Felix, Caroline said. At every leaf of the ledger, from Lady Day 1784 to the Sunday the 5th of December 1819, my late great-aunt set out at the head of the entry, the catalogued specimen at the species at the Latin and at the English, the date of the gathering, the locality of the gathering at the Derbyshire country, the stratum at which the specimen was observed at the locality, and the cabinet drawer at the South Library at which the specimen was lodged. The ledger sets out 387 catalogued specimens at the said 35 years and 7 months of her widowhood and her marriage. Caroline turned the open ledger at the writing table at the south sashlight so that the open page was set out at Sir Felix and at Mr. Whitehurst across the table. The 387 catalogued specimens are at the following matter: 148 brachiopods, the Productus giganteus, the Spirifer striatus, the Athyrus roycei, 86 rugose and tabulate corals, the Lithostrontium junceum, the Syringapora ramulosa, 63 crinoid ossicles and stems, the Woodocrinus macrodactylus, 42 bryozoans, the Phenostella plebea, 32 gastropods, the Bellerophon costatus, 8 cephalopods, the Goniotites striatus. All of them at the Carboniferous limestone of the mountain limestone of the Derbyshire country, at the Castleton outcrop, or at the Mamtor escarpment, or at the Treak Cliff lead mining outcrop. All of them Carboniferous, all of them Derbyshire. She lifted her warm hazel eyes from the open ledger to Sir Felix across the writing table. At no leaf at any of the 35 years of catalogued specimens has my late great-aunt set out a trilobite. Calamine blumenbachii is at no entry at any year. No species of the genus Calamine is at any year. No trilobite at any genus at any leaf of the ledger, from the Lady Day of 1784 to the 5th of December, 1819. The cabinet at which Sir Felix claims to have watched my late great-aunt catalogue the specimen on the 14th of September, 1818 holds 387 specimens, every one a Derbyshire Carboniferous limestone fossil, and not one a trilobite at any year. Sir Felix at the Peak District oak chair lifted his oily smile at the corner of the mouth and gave the South Library a small Derby shrug at the broad, gout-flushed shoulder. Mrs. Harcourt did not catalogue every fossil at her ledger, Miss Harcourt, he said in the loud Derby voice. A trilobite at the Castleton cave system at September is a private matter, and she would not have set it out at the ledger as a matter of public talk. She catalogued it at the cabinet at the South Library, at the interview between her and me, at the afternoon of the said day. The ledger says nothing to the matter. Caroline did not answer at the shrug. She set her right hand at Mr. William Smith's 1815 A Delineation of the Strata of England and Wales at her left elbow, lifted the small brass paperweight from the open page, and turned the open volume at the writing table at the south sash light, so that the open page was set out at Sir Felix and at Mr. Whitehurst across the table. The second matter is Mr. William Smith's A Delineation of the Strata of England and Wales of the Year of our Lord, 1815, the same stratigraphic work my late great-aunt kept at this South Library all the years of her widowhood, and the same Mr. William Smith of Marsham Street, London, with whom my late great-aunt was at letter at the years 1816 to 1819 in the matter of the Derbyshire country. The open page is the Derbyshire section. Mr. Bakewell Smith has examined the volume at this South Library on the Monday the 17th of January last, and has set his Derby initials at the Derbyshire section margin. Mr. Bakewell Smith lifted his gold spectacles a half-inch at the nose, looked across the table at the open volume, and gave the small Derby nod for the room to see. Sir Felix, Mr. Whitehurst, the Derbyshire section of Mr. Smith's stratigraphic map sets out the matter at the plain Derbyshire country in the level fashion of the surveyor of Marsham Street. The rocks of the Castleton outcrop, of the Mamtor escarpment, of the Treak Cliff lead mining outcrop, of the Peak District country at every locality at which my late great-aunt gathered a specimen at any year, are Carboniferous limestone, the mountain limestone, deposited at the Mississippian sub-period. The Castleton country is Carboniferous limestone at every yard of the south slope and at every yard of the cave system below the hill. She set her plain right forefinger at the printed line at the Derbyshire section margin at the south sash light and read at the page. The Castleton country of the Derbyshire Peak District is at the upper mountain limestone of the Carboniferous limestone, the said stratum deposited in the Mississippian sub-period of the Carboniferous system, at which stratum are observed the brachiopods, the corals, the crinoids, the bryozoans, the gastropods of the said mountain limestone, and at which stratum no earlier fauna may be observed. Caroline turned the leaf of the open volume at the south sash to the next page at the Derbyshire section. The species Calamine blumenbachi, the trilobite Sir Felix has named, is at the Wenlock limestone of the Silurian system. 3 full geological systems earlier than the Carboniferous limestone of the Derbyshire country. The Cambrian, the Ordovician, the Silurian, 3 full systems of the British strata, come at the geological column before the Devonian and the Carboniferous of the mountain limestone. The Wenlock limestone of the Silurian is at the Welsh Marches at Wenlock Edge and at Dudley. The Wenlock does not outcrop in Derbyshire at any locality, nor at the Castleton cave system, nor at the Mamtor escarpment, nor at the Treat Cliff outcrop. Calamine blumenbachi is at the Wenlock of the Welsh Marches and at no other British stratum at any other county. The trilobite cannot be observed in the Derbyshire Carboniferous limestone of the Castleton country at any locality. Sir Felix lifted the Derby smile at the corner of the small mouth again. The smile was not quite so oily at the corner. Mr. Smith is a surveyor at Marsham Street, London, and not at Derbyshire, Miss Harcourt. He may be mistaken at the matter of the Castleton outcrop at the Peak District. A late observation of the trilobite at the Castleton cave system at September 1818 would not be set out at a 1815 Marsham Street volume, for the plain reason that it had not occurred at the writing of the volume. Mrs. Harcourt had gathered the fossil at the cave system at the morning of the said day, and I had seen the trilobite at the rock cabinet at the South Library at the afternoon of the same. The 1815 stratigraphic map is not at the matter. Caroline did not lift her warm hazel eyes from Sir Felix at the Peak District oak chair. The third matter, Sir Felix, is Mr. William Smith of Marsham Street, London's own letter at my late great-aunt at this South Library of the 14th day of May, in the year of our Lord 1819, that is to say, the 8th month after the date you have set out at Mr. Whitehurst's paper, and the 7th month before her death, at this South Library on the Wednesday the 8th of December last. The letter has lately come down at my own hand from the Bakewell Parsonage, South Parlour, having been given me by my father, the Reverend Hadrian Harcourt, at the parsonage door, at my departure for Harcourt Hall on the Saturday the 8th of January last, for the plain reason that my late great-aunt had sent the said letter at my father at the parsonage at the Whitsun of 1819, in the same parcel as a private letter on the matter of my own geology correspondence at Mr. Smith at Marsham Street since the spring of 1817. She lifted the third bundle, a small fold of pale cream paper tied at a thin black mourning ribbon, from the Green Calf Geology Journal at her right hand, untied the black mourning ribbon at the south sash, opened the fold at the table and set the letter at the writing table at the south sash light. Mr. Bakewell Smith looked across the table at the open letter and gave the Derby nod. Mr. William Smith writes at my late great-aunt at this South Library, in his own hand at the Marsham Street Chambers, at the 14th of May, 1819. I read at the second leaf of the letter, the 4th and 5th lines from the head of the leaf. The trilobites of Calamine cannot be observed in the Derbyshire Carboniferous rocks, Mrs. Harcourt, for the plain reason that the species is at the Wenlock limestone of the Silurian system, at the Welsh Marches at Wenlock Edge, and at Dudley, and at no other British stratum at any other county. Your collection at Harcourt is rightly confined to the Carboniferous fauna of the mountain limestone, the brachiopods, the corals, the crinoids, which are the appropriate stratigraphic indices of the Derbyshire country. I do not look for any trilobite at any locality at the Peak District, at any depth, at any cave system, at any cliff face, at any year. The South Library was very quiet. The Reverend Tideswell at the long bench was not moving. Mr. Whitehurst was looking at Sir Felix at his left elbow, with the level Derby bar look of a man who has heard the last paper of the morning read out by an auburn-plaited curate's daughter, and has known at the second sentence that the brief at the Buff Roll is finished at the Derby Assize. Sir Felix did not lift the oily smile at the corner of the mouth. The mouth was set at the Derby line. The gout-flushed colour at the heavy jowl had paled beneath the bone at the eye. The primrose silk waistcoat had set out a small sheen of sweat at the silk. Caroline lifted her warm hazel eyes from the open letter to Sir Felix. Sir Felix, the trilobite Calamine blumenbachii is a Wenlock limestone species from the Silurian period, confined to the Welsh marches at Wenlock Edge and Dudley. The species cannot be observed in Derbyshire's Carboniferous limestone at Castleton or at any Peak District locality. Mr. Smith's 1815 stratigraphic map at this table confirms it. Mrs. Harcourt's collection at the South Library is British Carboniferous only. The fossil you have named cannot have been at the cabinet you set it out. Sir Felix did not move. The parole trust, you claim, rests at the trilobite at the rock cabinet. The trilobite rests at the Castleton cave system at the morning of the said day. The Castleton cave system is Carboniferous limestone of the Mississippian sub-period. Calamine blumenbachii is at the Wenlock limestone of the Silurian 3 full geological systems earlier, at the Welsh marches and at no other British stratum. The parole trust cannot stand at the foot. There is no trilobite at the Castleton cave system at any year. There is no specimen at any leaf of my late great-aunt's ledger. There is no parole trust. The Derby shoulders at the primrose silk waistcoat went down a half-inch at the chair, and then an inch, and then 3 inches, until Sir Felix was set forward at the table at his folded forearms, the oily smile gone from the mouth, the gout-flushed colour at the heavy jowl gone pale. He did not speak. Mr. Whitehurst lifted the long buff brief roll, tied the green tape at the head in the Derby fashion, rose, and bowed at Mr. Bakewell-Smith across the table. Mr. Bakewell-Smith, the claim of my client, Sir Felix Eddingham, is withdrawn at this interview. The folded paper at the Derby Prerogative Court of the Tuesday the 11th of January last is withdrawn. The brief at the buff roll is finished at the Derby Bar. I beg the leave of the interview to withdraw. Mr. Bakewell-Smith rose and gave the Derby bow. Mr. Whitehurst, the withdrawal is at the record at the Derby Prerogative Court at the Tuesday following at my own hand. The interview is closed. Mr. Whitehurst took up the buff brief roll, set his spectacles at the fold pocket at the dark wool coat, did not look down at Sir Felix, and walked across the South Library to the door. Mr. Buxton opened the door at his standing place. Mr. Whitehurst passed without looking back, and the south porch door at the South Hall closed at his footstep behind him. Sir Felix at the Peak District oak chair did not lift the gout-flushed head. The thick forearms held the weight of the broad shoulders at the primrose silk waistcoat. The oily smile had not come back. The heavy jowl was pale at the south sash. Mr. Bakewell-Smith set the Derby initials at the Friargate Chambers ledger at the closed interview line. Sir Felix, the interview is closed at the matter of the said claim. Mr. Whitehurst has withdrawn at the brief. Miss Harcourt has set out the 3 matters. Your late kinswoman's rock cabinet ledger of 1784 to 1819 sets out at every leaf the catalogued specimen at the Derbyshire Carboniferous limestone, 387 specimens of the mountain limestone, and the trilobite is at no leaf at any year. Mr. William Smith's 1815. A delineation of the strata of England and Wales sets out the Castleton country as Carboniferous limestone, and sets out Calamine blumenbachii as a Wenlock limestone species of the Silurian, confined to the Welsh marches. Mr. Smith's own letter of the 14th of May, 1819, sets out at his hand that the trilobite cannot be observed in the Derbyshire Carboniferous rocks at any locality at any year. The specimen cannot have been at the cabinet at the South Library, for the plain reason that the species cannot have been at the Castleton cave system at any morning of any year. The parole trust cannot stand. The interview is closed. He set the closed ledger at the writing table. He looked across at Caroline, gave the small Derby nod, and said the line for the South Library to keep. Miss Harcourt, the matter is settled. The fossil has settled it. Caroline Harcourt closed the open a delineation of the strata of England and Wales at the Derbyshire section, laid the small brass paperweight at the cover, set the rock cabinet ledger and the open letter of the 14th of May, 1819 at the green silk ribbon at the centre of the table, and gave the small civil curtsy at Mr. Bakewell Smith. Mr. Bakewell Smith, I thank you for the interview. The 3 matters are at the writing table for your Derby initial at the closing of the interview. Mr. Bakewell Smith set the Derby initials BW-S at the closed cover of the volume, at the open letter, and at the green silk ribbon of the rock cabinet ledger. He closed the Friargate Chambers ledger, gave the Derby nod at the south sash, and walked across the South Library to the door, where Mr. Buxton held the door open. He did not look back at Sir Felix. The Reverend Tideswell rose at the plain black gown brushed clean, gave Caroline the small Harcourt by Bakewell parish nod he had kept for her since her arrival at the hall, and walked to the door at Mr. Bakewell Smith's elbow. The South Library door closed in the Derbyshire fashion behind them. Sir Felix Eddingham lifted the gout-flushed head an inch from the folded forearms, did not look at Caroline, did not look at the closed volume, did not look at the green silk ribbon of the rock cabinet ledger, and rose at the Derby heel. The primrose silk waistcoat had set out a thin sheen of sweat at the silk. The thin mouth was set at the Derby line. He bowed at the South Library, in the fashion of a man who has lost the small good business he set out for at the South Porch. Miss Harcourt. He walked to the South Library door, where Mr. Buxton held it open. He did not look at the rock cabinet ledger at the centre of the writing table. He passed without word, and the South Porch door at the South Hall closed at his footstep behind him. Caroline Harcourt heard the carriage wheels at the South Drive turn at the gravel and pass at the South Gate Piers and out at the Harcourt by Bakewell Lane. She did not lift the small lace cap at the auburn plait at the nape. She set her plain right hand at the green silk ribbon of the rock cabinet ledger at the centre of the writing table, set the open letter of the 14th of May, 1819 at the fold of pale cream paper at the thin black mourning ribbon, set the closed volume at the small brass paperweight at her left elbow, and laid the green calf geology journal at her right hand at the south sash. The thin pale west wind at the Derbyshire Wye Valley at the south slope had dropped at the south chimney. The sky, the colour of old pewter at the south sash, had lightened a half shade at the south slope. The small Derby china pot of fresh ink at the writing table was still full at the rim. The second sash candle at the writing table was unlit at the brass holder. Caroline lifted the small brass caliper at the green calf geology journal at her right hand, opened the journal at the south sash light at the next blank leaf at the back of the closed-out quarter, and set the line at the head of the leaf in her plain Bakewell hand. Harcourt Hall, South Library, the trilobite at Sir Felix Eddingham's claim of parole trust of September 14th, 1818. Species Calamine blumenbachii at the Wenlock limestone of the Silurian system, confined to the Welsh marches at Wenlock Edge and at Dudley. Castleton country at the Carboniferous limestone of the mountain limestone of the Mississippian subperiod. 3 full geological systems later than the Wenlock. Species cannot be observed at the Castleton cave system at any locality at any year. Mrs. Theodora's rock cabinet ledger, 1784 to 1819, at 387, catalogued specimens at no trilobite at any leaf. Mr. William Smith's letter of May 14th, 1819 at the trilobite at the Wenlock, at the Welsh marches and at no Derbyshire locality. Claim withdrawn at Mr. Whitehurst at the writing table. Interview closed at Mr. Bakewell Smith at the said hour. The fossil has settled it. She set the small brass caliper at the closed journal. She rose at the south sash, walked to the rock cabinet at the north wall, lifted the Productus giganteus brachiopod from the velvet specimen tray, set it at the long bench at the window where the Reverend Tideswell had been sat, and laid the small brass caliper at the velvet tray at the cabinet shelf. The south library was quiet at the south sash. Mrs. Castleton, the Harcourt housekeeper, came at the south library door at the Peak District step, set the small Derby china tray with the brown Peak District tea, and a plate of the parlour cut bread and Derbyshire butter at the writing table at Caroline's right elbow, lifted the small curtsy at the south sash she kept for the heiress of Harcourt Hall at the close of a hard morning, and went out at the south library door at the Derbyshire fashion behind her. Caroline Harcourt set the small Derby china teacup at the brown Peak District tea at the south sash light, and laid her warm hazel eyes at the south slope, at the Derbyshire Wye Valley at the south sash, where the thin pale west wind had dropped at the south chimney, and the sky, the colour of old pewter at the south sash, had lightened a half shade at the south slope, and the trilobite Calimene Blumenbachii had been confined to the Wenlock limestone of the Welsh Marches, these three full geological systems before the Carboniferous limestone of the Derbyshire country, and the matter at the writing table at the south sash was settled at the fossil. The late January at Harcourt settled into a careful rhythm that took Caroline between the South Library at the Hall and the parsonage at Bakewell, a short 3 miles south of the home pasture. She kept Mondays at the parsonage with her widowed father, the Reverend Hadrian Harcourt, who held the curacy of All Saints Bakewell, as he had these 22 years past. She kept Tuesdays for the Harcourt parish poor, with Mrs. Castleton at the housekeeper's keys. She kept Wednesdays for the home pasture accounts, with Mr. Edale at the steward's strong cupboard. She kept Thursdays for the South Library writing table, at her late great-aunt's own green calf rock cabinet ledger of 35 years, that Mrs. Theodora Harcourt had kept at the South Library since her marriage of 1784. She kept Fridays for the South Library at her own green calf geology journal of 1815 to 1819 of the Derbyshire Peak District strata she had kept at the parsonage south parlour these 5 years past. She kept Saturdays for the parish school geology class at the south porch, with the 6 village girls Reverend Tideswell had laid at her hand at the rectory tea of the second Sunday of January. She kept Sundays for St. Mary's of Harcourt by Bakewell at the south porch, and the rectory tea following. With Reverend Tideswell, in the gentle Derbyshire fashion, the late Mrs. Theodora Harcourt had kept in her own day. In the matter of the early Peak District spring, Caroline walked the home pasture and the Carboniferous limestone outcrop at the south slope through the February and into the early March, the small brass caliper and the plain calf-bound field book laid at her hand, and she took up the brachiopod at the south slope and the crinoid stem at the south outcrop and the coral fragment at the upper millstone grit edge in her own green calf geology journal at the central crease in the careful Derbyshire fashion of her 5 Peak District seasons past. In the first week of February, Mrs. Castleton at the Brick Hob proposed Miss Damaris Castleton, her niece of 24 at Castleton Village. Miss Damaris Castleton was a small, fair, Castleton-bred young woman of plain dark wool and a settled honesty. The 6 Harcourt village girls of the Saturday geology class were named once at the Reverend Tideswell's parish school list in the South Library hand of Caroline herself. Hetty Buxton at 13, the butler's youngest niece at the village, Patience Edale at 12, the steward's eldest daughter at the home pasture cottage. Damaris Castleton at 14, the housekeeper's grandniece at Castleton Village, the small cousin of the reading companion, Miss Damaris, at the South Library window. Letitia Tideswell at 11, the curate's middle daughter at the rectory. Faith Bakewell Smith at 12, the Derby solicitor's grandniece lodging with her aunt at the village, and Sophie Whitehurst at 13, the village schoolmistress's daughter, no relation to Sir Felix Eddingham's barrister of the Wednesday past, These were the 6 who came over from the village on the Saturday afternoons through the late winter and the gentle Peak District spring. The parish school Saturday geology class at the South Porch was, in Caroline's own settled understanding of the matter at the South Library writing table, the chief expansion of her late great-aunt's settled wish at the Harcourt rock cabinets of 1784 to 1819. She had the 6 village girls at the South Porch from the early afternoon through the close of the afternoon, and she took up with them the gentle sketching of the Peak District Carboniferous fauna in the careful Whitehurst fashion of the South Library writing voice. She laid at the South Porch reading table Mrs. Theodora's own Harcourt rock cabinet of 35 years at the crinoid drawer, and brought up a perfect Carboniferous limestone crinoid stem of the Castleton South outcrop her late great-aunt had gathered at the Mamtor escarpment in the gentle Derbyshire spring of 1792. She laid the crinoid stem at the plain dark oak South Porch reading table with the small brass caliper at the upper edge, and read out the late Mrs. Theodora's italic catalogue entry of the May of 1792 of the crinoid stem at the Mamtor escarpment in the plain Whitehurst reckoning of the South Library writing voice. She set Hetty Buxton and Patience Edale at the upper joints of the crinoid stem, the small 5-fold radial symmetry of the calyx, and the careful columnar segments at the lower stem in the plain Derbyshire reckoning of the South Porch reading table. She set Damaris Castleton and Letitia Tideswell at the middle of the crinoid stem, the careful articulation of the columnar joints and the small petal-shaped pores at the segment faces in the plain Whitehurst reckoning of the South Porch. She set Faith Bakewell-Smith and Sophie Whitehurst at the lower stem and the small Carboniferous matrix at the base, the careful warm grey of the mountain limestone at the south slope, and the gentle pale of the crinoid stem at the upper face in the Plain Peak District reckoning of the South Porch reading table. The 6 village girls each took up a small homemade copybook of plain Bakewell woolcloth at the cover that Mrs. Castleton at the housekeeper's keys had set up for the class at the South Press at the upper landing, and they began at the South Porch reading table their own small sketches of the Carboniferous crinoid stem in pencil and sable wash, copying down at the small reading table the gentle Whitehurst observation Caroline read out at the South Porch in her own gentle Derbyshire reading voice. Caroline at the South Porch set out before the 6 village girls at the close of the sketching hour the settled stratigraphic principle that the late Mrs. Theodora had kept at the South Library writing table from her own Whitehurst correspondence of 1784 onward, that the fossils of the Peak District country succeed each other in a definite order through the strata of the upper crust, the lower Carboniferous limestone fauna at the south slope, at the brachiopod, and the crinoid and the coral, the millstone grit at the upper ridge above, and the coal measures at the higher Derbyshire ground further on, and that the order at the south slope at Castleton and Mamtor and the upper Peak District country was the same order Mr. Smith of the 1815 delineation of the strata had set out at every Carboniferous outcrop of the British country. The 6 village girls at the South Porch took down the stratigraphic principle of the succession of the fossils at the South Porch reading table in the small homemade copybooks at the close of the sketching hour, and Caroline at the South Porch closed the class hour with Mrs. Castleton at the brick hob, bringing in the milk and honey at the South Porch, and the 6 village girls walking back at Mr. Edale's careful direction at the home pasture path to the village. Caroline at the South Library writing table at the close of each Saturday set down in her own green-calf geology journal at the central crease the crinoid stem the 6 village girls had taken at the class hour. And by the close of the April, the 6 village girls of the Harcourt parish had each a small homemade copybook of pencil and sable wash of the crinoid stem, drawn from Mrs. Theodora's own rock cabinet at the South Library writing table, with the settled Whitehurst Smith principle of the succession of the fossils at the inner cover of the small copybook in the South Library hand of Caroline herself. Mr. Edale walked the home pasture at his usual rounds through the late February and the early March, and reported the lambing at the south slope as fair for the year, the steward's strong cupboard rentals at the plain Derbyshire, reckoning of the late Mrs. Theodora's own books, these many years past, and the apple orchard at the east at 3 acres of Peak District russets, as settled at the Bakewell dressing. The Wednesday of the 22nd of March came in upon Harcourt with the soft, pale yellow Peak District light of an early spring afternoon at the South Library writing table, and Caroline at the South Library writing table opened her late great-aunt's rock cabinet ledger of 1784 to 1819 at the plain dark oak reading chair the late Mrs. Theodora had kept at the south wall. She had not before opened the rock cabinet ledger at the May of 1791, having read through the years of 1784 to 1790 at the close of the Sir Felix Edingham matter, and the years of 1792 to 1810 at the dark oak of the February. The rock cabinet ledger of 1791 was a plain dark calf folio of Derby 1791 with the italic of Mrs. Theodora Harcourt at the inner leaves, and Caroline turned through twice the pages of the spring of 1791, and came at the close of her turning to the page of the 14th of May, 1791, at the Treak Cliff South outcrop of Castleton. She found at that page, laid in at the margin, a small ink sketch of a perfect blue John fluorite crystal of the Treak Cliff South outcrop, the careful banded purple of the upper face, and the warm cream of the lower face at the gentle Peak District close of a May morning. And at the margin of the sketch, in the italic of her late great-aunt's own hand, a settled marginal note, this 14th of May, 1791. The morning of dear Hadrian's marriage, to my niece Mrs. Sarah Edingham at St. Mary's of Harcourt by Bakewell. I have at this hour walked to Treak Cliff at Castleton, and gathered a perfect blue John fluorite crystal at the South outcrop. My niece's first child shall have her own blue John at the South Library in her own time. The rock cabinets shall stand at the South Library for that hand. T. H. The 14th of May, 1791, was the morning of her own father's wedding at St. Mary's of Harcourt by Bakewell, to her late mother, Mrs. Sarah Edingham Harcourt, the marriage Caroline had heard of in passing at the parsonage south parlour in her father's plain Derbyshire reserve at the small Derby miniature of the Edingham family of 1791 at the south parlour writing desk. The Edingham name at the small Derby miniature was the same Edingham name of Sir Felix Edingham of Edingham Hall near Derby, who had stood at the South Library of Harcourt at the Wednesday of the 19th of January past. Sir Felix was the second son of the late Sir Mortimer Edingham, 3rd Baronet, and the late Mrs. Sarah Edingham Harcourt was the only daughter of Sir Mortimer's elder brother, Mr. Theophilus Edingham of Matlock, the niece of Mrs. Theodora Harcourt by the Edingham line, and Sir Felix Edingham was Caroline's own distant cousin of the 2nd degree at the Edingham line of the Derby family. Her late great-aunt had laid in at the rock cabinet ledger, at the page of her niece's wedding morning, a small blue John fluorite crystal of the Treak Cliff South outcrop as her own settled labour against the 29 years that lay between her niece's wedding morning and the first child of the niece. The first child of the niece had been laid at the parsonage of Bakewell at the Derbyshire February of 1792, and the first child of the niece, Mrs. Sarah Edingham Harcourt, was Caroline herself. Mrs. Theodora had laid aside the rock cabinet ledger of 1791, 29 years before, for the first child of the niece. Caroline closed the rock cabinet ledger of 1791, and stood at the South Library window, in the soft, pale yellow Peak District light of the early spring afternoon, in a settled silence of 10 minutes. The South Library window gave it the home pasture and the apple orchard and the walled south garden at the south slope above the Derbyshire Y, and the soft, Peak District light stood at the South Library writing table, at the rock cabinet ledger, at the page of the 14th of May. Mrs. Castleton at the brick hob in the kitchen at the south passage was silent at the housekeeper's keys. The late Mrs. Theodora's own green calf rock cabinet ledger of 35 years stood at the dark oak open at the May of 1791 page. Caroline took up her own green calf geology journal of 1815 to 1819 at the dark oak reading table at the South Library window and copied down at the central crease in her own italic the entry of the 14th of May, 1791, of Mrs. Theodora's rock cabinet ledger, the small blue John fluorite crystal of the Treak Cliff south outcrop of Castleton, the italic marginal note of her late great-aunt's hand at the wedding morning of her niece, and the settled wish of Mrs. Theodora that the rock cabinets should be for the hand of the first child of the niece. She laid the rock cabinet ledger at the South Library writing table at the close of the entry, and laid her own green calf geology journal at the central crease at the dark oak reading table. The matter of the rock cabinet ledger of 1791 at the page of the 14th of May was settled at Harcourt at the close of the spring afternoon in the plain Derbyshire, reckoning of the Peak District parishes. The Wednesday of the 12th of April brought the Reverend Tideswell over from the rectory to the South Library tea, and he confirmed, in his Derbyshire reserve at the South Library window, that Mrs. Theodora Harcourt, at her last conversation at her south bedchamber in the November of 1819, had asked him to bring "my small peak candle," the late Mrs. Theodora's own settled name for Caroline at the parsonage these many years past, the rock cabinet ledger of 1791, at the page of the 14th of May of the small blue John of the Treak Cliff south outcrop, with my settled asking pardon. The Reverend Tideswell had meant to speak of the matter at the South Library at the close of January, and had let the parsonage to Harcourt settling and the Sir Felix Eddingham matter of the Wednesday of the 19th of January pass first. He asked Caroline's pardon for the plain Derbyshire delay. The Reverend Tideswell observed at the South Library window, in his plain Harcourt parish curate's manner, that the late Mrs. Theodora had at the south bedchamber asked him to lay the matter at Caroline's hand at the parish curate's own settled discretion, and that she had asked him further to say at the South Library, in her own settled wording, that the 3 short miles between Harcourt Hall and the Bakewell parsonage had been at her hand to bridge from the spring of 1791 onward, the spring of her own niece's wedding, to dear Hadrian at St. Mary's of Harcourt by Bakewell, that she had not, in the matter of the Reverend Hadrian Harcourt of Bakewell and the parting of 1788 at the Eddingham Hall settlement, brought herself to the bridge, and that the rock cabinet ledger of 1791, the small blue John of the Treak Cliff south outcrop, laid in on her niece's wedding morning for the first child of the niece, was the matter she had meant the small peak candle to take up at the South Library writing table in her own time. Caroline received the Reverend Tideswell's confirmation at the South Library window in her own settled silence, and asked the Reverend Tideswell to take the South Library tea in the plain Derbyshire fashion her late great-aunt had kept, on the rectory tea, Wednesdays of her own day, Mrs. Castleton at the brick hob laying the small Harcourt tea service of 1791 at the South Library writing table. Lady Day Quarterday at the 25th of March brought Mr. Edale to the South Library writing table, with the home pasture accounts and the steward's strong cupboard rentals settled at the plain Derbyshire, reckoning of the late Mrs. Theodora's own books, the rentals of the Harcourt Peak District parish tenancies at the home pasture and the apple orchard and the walled south garden and the fossil display pavilion at the south wall, brought up at the plain steward's hand of his 30 years at the Harcourt, living in the plain fashion her late great-aunt had kept of the Lady Day quarter-day these many years past. In the middle of April, Mrs. Castleton at the housekeeper's keys brought up the Harcourt family pearls, a single strand of small Derbyshire river pearls of 1789 in a worn dark cuff case, the Harcourt pearls Sir Augustus Harcourt had set at the Derby goldsmiths for his bride, Mrs. Theodora Harcourt, at the spring of 1789. The pearls Mrs. Theodora had kept at the upper press at the South Landing through her widowhood of 1810 to 1819, and laid them on the South Library writing table at Caroline's own settled wish. The Wednesday of the 12th of April at the South Library, at the close of the geology class hour, the 6 village girls presented Caroline at the South Library window with a small calf-bound wildflower album of the Peak District meadow hedgerows the 6 girls had gathered through the early spring at the South Slope and the apple orchard, and the village schoolmistress Mrs. Whitehurst's own well-used copy of Mr. Croxall's 1722 Aesop's Fables in plain Bakewell woolcloth at the cover, the wildflower album laid at the writing table at Caroline's hand by Hetty Buxton at the close of the class hour. By the late April, the half-mourning at Harcourt had eased by the gentle Derbyshire reckoning of the 4 months past the December of 1819, and Mrs. Castleton at the housekeeper's keys produced from the late Mrs. Theodora's south press at the upper landing a cream and peach sprigged muslin morning gown of the Derby dressmaker's hand of 1818 that Mrs. Theodora had not lived to take into wear. Caroline took the muslin into wear at the South Library at the close of the month, in the gentle Derbyshire fashion her late great-aunt had kept in her own day, the unrelieved black gabardine set by at the upper press. Easter Sunday, at the 23rd of April, 1820 came in upon Harcourt by Bakewell in the soft, pale yellow Peak District light of the late April morning at St. Mary's. Reverend Tideswell preached the Easter sermon from the Epistle of the Morning, in his plain Derbyshire fashion, at the south pulpit of St. Mary's. Mr. Buxton, at the south door of the church, had received the parish at the south porch in the early morning, and Mrs. Castleton, at the Harcourt pew at the south aisle, had laid the Harcourt pew cushions at the dark oak. Caroline at the Harcourt pew in her cream and peach sprigged muslin and a small sprig of early Derbyshire wild thyme at the bodice took the parish Easter service in the gentle Derbyshire fashion her late great-aunt had kept at this pew these many years past. After the close of the service, the parish came out at the south porch of St. Mary's into the soft, pale yellow Peak District light of the Easter Sunday late morning, and Reverend Tideswell at the south porch inclined to a tall, lean, honey-fawn-coated gentleman who had stood at the rear of the south aisle through the service and who had come forward at the close to the south porch. Lord Marmaduke Sherborne was tall, lean 6'1", dark chestnut hair lately silvering, warm hazel eyes the colour of Derbyshire honey, gentle firm mouth, weathered fair Cambridge train skin, honey-fawn morning coat over cream waistcoat. Reverend Tideswell at the south porch inclined to Caroline, and inclined to his lordship, and made the introduction in his settled Derbyshire fashion, verbatim at the south porch of St. Mary's of Harcourt by Bakewell, Miss Harcourt, his lordship Marmaduke Aubrey Sherborne, 5th Viscount Sherborne, of Sherborne Park, 10 miles east on the Derwent Valley, near Chatsworth. Lord Sherborne is the lay patron of the Harcourt, living these 8 years past, and a Fellow of the Geological Society of London these 3 years past. Lord Sherborne at the south porch inclined to Caroline in the Cambridge-trained Derbyshire fashion of the Peak District parishes. He observed, at the south porch in his settled plain manner, that he had known the late Mrs. Theodora Harcourt from the year of his own coming down to Sherborne Park in 1814 through to her last autumn of 1819 at the Geological Society's Derbyshire stratigraphic papers, and that he had seen the late Mrs. Theodora's own Derbyshire stratigraphic cross-sections at the Society at every season from the autumn of 1814 through the spring of 1819. He observed at the South Porch in his Cambridge-trained manner that he had been moved at the December bereavement of the late Mrs. Theodora Harcourt at the close of the year past, and had laid his own small condolence at the rectory at the second week of December at the Reverend Tideswell's hand. He observed that at the parish school inspection of the September of 1819, Reverend Tideswell had laid at his hand at the South Library writing table one of the late Mrs. Theodora's own stratigraphic cross-section pages, the Carboniferous limestone south slope of Castleton at the Mamtor Escarpment, with the Millstone Grit at the upper ridge and the Lower Mountain limestone at the south outcrop, laid out in the Plainsmith reckoning of the 1815 delineation of the strata at the lower margin, and that he had at the time remarked at the Reverend Tideswell's hand the Cambridge quality observation of the stratigraphic cross-section, the careful pencil at the Carboniferous limestone at the south slope, and the warm grey wash at the mountain limestone at the south outcrop, and the small Smith italic captions of the late Mrs. Theodora's hand at the lower margin in the Plainsmith reckoning of the 1815 delineation, and the small marginal note at the Treak Cliff Blue John outcrop that Lord Sherborne had not before seen at any of the Peak District stratigraphers' hands. He observed, in his plain Derbyshire manner at the South Porch, that he had not in his 8 years at Sherborne Park expected to see that hand continue at the South Library writing table after the December of 1819, and that the matter of the parish school Saturday geology class at the South Porch through the late winter and the early spring had been brought to his hand at Sherborne Park by the Reverend Tideswell at the 3 Sunday rectory teas past. Caroline at the South Porch, in her cream and peach sprigged muslin and the small sprig of early Derbyshire wild thyme at the bodice, received Lord Sherborne's settled observation in the gentle Derbyshire fashion her late great-aunt had kept in her own day at this porch. She inclined to his lordship in the manner of the Bakewell parsonage of her own girlhood. She replied at the South Porch in her own settled trait, in the plain Derbyshire fashion of the Peak District parishes. Lord Sherborne. The rock cabinet at Harcourt I shall continue at my late great-aunt's settled wish. Lord Sherborne at the South Porch inclined to Caroline at the close of her sentence, in the Cambridge-trained Derbyshire fashion that the Peak District parishes had known of the lay patron of the Harcourt living these 8 years past, and observed that he was glad of the matter, and that he should hope to make his settled call at the South Library at Harcourt at the Tuesday following the close of Easter week. If the new mistress of the hall should receive him at the South Library at the gentle Derbyshire hour, the late Mrs. Theodora had kept for her own Tuesday calls in her own day. Caroline at the South Porch, in the soft, pale yellow Peak District light of the Easter Sunday late morning, inclined to Lord Sherborne, and replied that she should receive Lord Sherborne at the South Library at the Tuesday call the late great-aunt had kept in her own day. And the matter at the South Porch was settled in the plain Derbyshire fashion of the Peak District parishes. Reverend Tideswell at the South Porch walked Caroline and Lord Sherborne to the Lich Gate of St. Mary's at the South Churchyard wall, where the late Mrs. Theodora Harcourt's plain Derby-set memorial stone of December 1819 stood at the south wall at the third grave from the Lich Gate. Lord Sherborne at the Lich Gate took his leave of Reverend Tideswell and of Caroline in the Cambridge-trained Derbyshire fashion, and walked at the South Churchyard path to the Sherborne Park carriage at the rectory wall. Caroline at the Lich Gate took her own leave of Reverend Tideswell in the plain Derbyshire fashion of the Peak District parishes, and walked back at the Derbyshire South Churchyard path to the south door of Harcourt Hall. Mrs. Castleton at the housekeeper's keys, 3 paces behind in plum bombazine and lace cap. Caroline at the south door of Harcourt Hall inclined to Mrs. Castleton at the close of the short 3 miles, and Mrs. Castleton at the south door took the cream and peach sprigged muslin bonnet at the inner hall in the plain Derbyshire fashion of the late Mrs. Theodora's own day. The matter of the south porch at the Easter Sunday of the 23rd of April was settled at Harcourt at the plain Derbyshire, reckoning of the late Mrs. Theodora Harcourt's own settled wish. Saturday, the 6th of May, 1820, came in upon Harcourt Hall at a pale Derbyshire morning of fresh May green at the home pasture and pearl grey weather upon the carboniferous limestone outcrop above the Wye, and at not much past 2 of the afternoon, Mr. Buxton at the south door announced the carriage from Sherborne Park, 10 miles east in the Derwent Valley. Lord Marmaduke Aubrey Sherborne, the 5th Viscount, came up the gravel sweep in his Cambridge fawn morning coat over a cream waistcoat at the patient pace of a 41-year-old widower of 7 years, dark chestnut hair lately silvering, warm hazel eyes the colour of Derbyshire honeyset at the south front of the manor, and at his left hand his small daughter, Lady Adelaide Sherborne, at her 8 years, in soft peach ribbons and a cream muslin pelisse, the soft auburn hair plaited at the nape, the warm hazel eyes plain at the millstone grit south porch. Behind Lord Sherborne came down at the gravel 3 Sherborne Sandys connections. Lady Honoria Sherborne Sandys, his elder sister of 39 in dove-grey poplin, Lady Frances Sherborne Sandys, his cousin of the same age in slate silk, and Lady Constance Sherborne Sandys, his younger sister of 39 in a plain walking bonnet, and at their hand Mr. Quentin Sandys at 50 in dark wool, Mr. Hubert Sandys at 46 in honey fawn cloth, and Mr. Aldous Sandys at 44 in plain dark blue. The Dowager Lady Sherborne, at 66 in plum and grey bombazine, came down last, at her son's hand. Mrs. Castleton received the Sherborne party at the South Library at the close of the 2nd hour. The long warm room of the south front lay open at the fresh May light at the 4 mullioned windows, the millstone grit chimney-piece at the west wall, the 384 volumes at the north and east shelves, and at the southwest corner, the walnut rock cabinet of 12 shallow drawers at Mrs. Theodora's hand. Mrs. Castleton, in her lace cap and plum bombazine, set out the Derby tea service of 1789 at the round mahogany table by the second sash, and poured the tea at the Derbyshire fashion of the Harcourt household. The Dowager took the chair at the round table at Caroline's left hand, Lady Adelaide the small chair at Caroline's right, Lord Sherborne the chair at the south sash, and the Sherborne Sandys cousins at the long oak table. Mr. Buxton stood at the south door at the household's plain Derbyshire courtesy. Lord Sherborne took his Derby cup at the saucer and set it down and turned at his place at the round mahogany table. Miss Harcourt. I have read the privately printed quarto your late great-aunt set down at the Castleton Mamtor stratigraphic section in the spring of 1815, the small 51-page Cambridge press at the Harcourt Rock Cabinet Ledger's correspondence. And at Sherborne Park, the South Library of my own, dear Lady Maria, stood at the Derbyshire strata, laying out at the 7 years of her keeping the cabinet, and at her death in the September of 1816, the South Library was closed at the Derbyshire section table and has not been laid out at the 4 years following. I am of the Geological Society of London at the 1817 election, and I should ask whether you might consent to lay out at the Sherborne Park South Library, across the summer, the small Derbyshire strata demonstration that my late wife had not the strength to set down at her closing year against the parish school 6-girl Saturday class she had begun at the spring of 1815. The matter wants only the Harcourt hand at the rock cabinet. Caroline set down her own Derby cup at the saucer at the round mahogany table. Lord Sherborne, the Sherborne Park South Library demonstration shall be laid out at the Derbyshire fashion the late Lady Maria had begun at the 1815 spring. I shall come over at the Tuesday at 3 at the Sherborne gig at Mrs. Castleton's chaperonage, and the Carboniferous strata shall stand at the table at her quiet order. Lady Adelaide, at the round table, looked up at her father at his place at the south sash, and then at Caroline at her left hand, and she set down her own small Derby cup at the small saucer. Miss Harcourt, may I help with the blue John crystals at the Sherborne South Library? Mamma had laid out the Treac Cliff fluorite at the 4th drawer at the cabinet in the spring of 1815, and she had not finished the cataloguing at her closing year. Lady Adelaide, the blue John crystals at the 4th drawer at the Sherborne cabinet shall be laid out at your own hand at the Tuesday afternoons, in the Derbyshire fashion the late Lady Maria had kept at her own South Library. The Tuesday calls began at Tuesday the 9th of May at the Sherborne gig at 3 at the South Porch. Mrs. Castleton took her bonnet at the South Hall and went over at the 10-mile road east to Sherborne Park, and Caroline at the small Cambridge gig at Lord Sherborne's right hand carried the green calf geology journal and the brass caliper, and a small black portfolio of Mrs. Theodora's stratigraphic sketches of 1815, and the late spring Peak District weather lay quiet at the home pasture at the soft pace of the late May country. At Sherborne Park, the South Library lay open at the round mahogany reading table and the long oak specimen table at the south windows, the rock cabinet of Lady Maria's keeping closed at the brass handles these 4 years, Lord Sherborne's own 1816 privately printed quarto, notes on the Derbyshire Carboniferous strata at Sherborne Park, Cambridge Press, 51 pages, laid at the reading stand at the second sash. Caroline took the quarto in her ungloved hand and read at the italic preface the careful Cambridge geology of Lord Sherborne's own hand, and the late Lady Maria's stratigraphic table at page 7, and the section diagram at the folded plate at page 19, and she did not speak at the first reading, because the quarto stood at the Derbyshire Carboniferous order. Mrs. Theodora's own ledger had stood at the South Library at Harcourt Hall. The Reverend Hadrian Harcourt came over from the Bakewell parsonage at the second Tuesday for the May fortnight, and took the second sash at his curate's plain dark wool and his quiet reading hour patience, and through the fortnight of the middle of May, the widowed Bakewell curate at his daughter's chaperone's side read the late Lady Maria's 1815 stratigraphic table at page 7, and the section diagram at page 19, at the parsonage italic he had kept at All Saints Bakewell these 22 years. Miss Harcourt, Lord Sherborne said at the third Tuesday at the round mahogany reading table, I had set the section diagram at page 19 at the south face of the home Sherborne outcrop at the upper mountain limestone, but I had not at the printing of the quarto considered the distinction your own great-aunt's 1808 ledger carried at the Castleton Mamtor section, between the lower mountain limestone of the Derbyshire Peak District at the Mississippian sub-period and the upper mountain limestone of the South Derwent Valley, standing at the small distinction your own hand drew at the brass caliper. I had at the 1816 printing set the matter as a single stratigraphic horizon. The distinction wants to stand at the second edition. Lord Sherborne, the distinction is Mrs. Theodora's. I had only the late great-aunt's 1808 ledger at the second drawer of the South Library cabinet at Harcourt Hall. Miss Harcourt, the Harcourt hand carried it down at Mrs. Theodora's ledger at the South Library, and it shall stand at the second edition of the notes on the Derbyshire Carboniferous strata at Sherborne Park, at the page 19 plate, at your own brass caliper. The matter shall stand at the Cambridge Press. On the soft, late afternoon of Tuesday, the 23rd of May, The Reverend Hadrian Harcourt at the second sash had laid down his Sherborne quarto at the reading shelf and stepped out at the south garden for the half-hour before dressing, and Mrs. Castleton at the chaperone's chair had risen at the housekeeper's keys and gone down at the still room at the Sherborne Park quiet order. Caroline at the round mahogany reading table and Lord Sherborne at her right hand read together at the quiet Sherborne silence the section diagram at page 19, and Lord Sherborne laid his ungloved hand at the broad outer margin of the folded plate at the small fair second, when Caroline's hand came down at the same margin to mark the page corner, and the two hands rested at the page corner in the gentle Derbyshire silence, the second of three, and Caroline lifted her warm hazel eyes at the silence, and met his warm hazel eyes at the round table, and Lord Sherborne did not move his hand at the page corner, and Caroline did not move her hand at the page corner, and the Derbyshire afternoon light came in at the south sash at the pale fair gold of the late May. The Wednesday walks began on Wednesday the 17th of May at the home pasture above the Wye. Lord Sherborne came over at the Cambridge gig at 4. Mrs. Castleton took her bonnet at the South Hall and walked at the dry stone wall 10 paces behind in her plum bombazine and lace cap, and Lord Sherborne and Caroline walked the home pasture at the Fair Peak district evening at the steady pace of the May country at the south slope of the Carboniferous limestone above the Wye, the upper terrace of the mountain limestone fresh at the May green, and the lower terrace at the small grey caves at the rock face. On Wednesday, the 7th of June, at the dry stone wall at the south corner of the home pasture, where the late spring Derbyshire wild thyme stood at full flower, at the small purple stand against the millstone grit at the south slope, rising fair above the Wye, Lord Sherborne stopped at the wall and gathered at his own hand a small sprig of the purple-flowered Derbyshire wild thyme at the quiet Derbyshire silence. He turned at the wall and gave it at Caroline's ungloved hand in the gentle Derbyshire silence, the second of 2. The upper Wye wind at the south of the pasture at the fair June evening. Caroline took the sprig at her ungloved hand, did not speak, and laid the purple-flowered sprig at the inner linen pouch of her muslin pelisse against the small cloth she had kept the geology pencil cleaning cloth in at her quiet Derbyshire habit since the autumn of 1815. The late June Saturday calls began at Lord Sherborne's request at the South Library at 4. Lady Adelaide came over at every 4th Saturday at her father's gig and helped at the Blue John fluorite plate at the walnut cabinet. Mrs. Castleton laid out plain seed cake and the Derby service at the round table, and the fair Derbyshire afternoon stood plain at the south sash these 4 Saturdays of late June and early July. On Saturday, the 8th of July, at 3 the Cambridge gig came in at the gravel sweep, and Lord Sherborne laid at the South Library a small-bound volume of Whitehurst's 1778 Inquiry into the original state and formation of the earth at the round mahogany table, the engraved plate of the Derbyshire Carboniferous section at the marker. The clock at the South Library struck 3 at the small Derbyshire chime at the moment Mr. Buxton closed the south door. Miss Harcourt, may I call at the Saturday following at 3? Lord Sherborne, you are very welcome at the Saturday. On Saturday, the 5th of August, at 3 at the fair Derbyshire afternoon, the South Library laid out at the Derby service at the round mahogany table, the home pasture at the south sash, standing fresh at the second hay harvest at the south slope above the Wye, the Carboniferous limestone outcrop at the upper terrace at the fair August green of the late Meadow Peak district. Mrs. Castleton at the chaperone's chair at the second sash had risen at the housekeeper's keys at the south corridor at the quiet Derbyshire minute, and left the South Library door at the broad, gentle Derbyshire afternoon gold. Lord Sherborne set his Derby cup at the saucer at the round table, and stood at his place at Caroline's right hand. The clock at the South Library struck 3. at the small Derbyshire chime at the closing of the south door behind Mrs. Castleton. Miss Harcourt, I am of an age and a Cambridge widower's quiet gravity that shall not lay out the matter at the long Derbyshire preface. I have called at the Tuesday reading hours these 15 Tuesdays past, and at the Wednesday walks these 12 Wednesdays past, and the warm Derbyshire regard at my own fair Cambridge hand has at no Tuesday and at no Wednesday been other than fair and steady and plain. I am asking now, on no other ground than that I have read the gentle italic of your stratigraphic notebooks these 4 months, and known by your late great-aunt's 1791 Blue John note that your hand is the next hand at the Harcourt rock cabinet, to do me the honour of becoming the next Lady Sherborne. Lady Adelaide, at her 8 years, has read the matter at her own hand, these 3 months past, at the Sherborne Park South Library walnut cabinet, and at the Wednesday last she said at the carriage home that the Blue John plate at the 4th drawer wanted only the gentle Harcourt hand at the Bakewell Parsonage italic, to lay her mamma's South Library out at her own fair order at the Sherborne Park Lady Day. I am asking at the Saturday afternoon in the gentle Derbyshire fashion, at her own quiet voice, and at the late Lady Maria's quiet blessing, kept these 4 years past. I shall stand at the South Library, at the gentle Derbyshire silence at the second of your answer. Caroline at the round mahogany table laid down her Derby cup at the saucer, and stood at her own place at Lord Sherborne's left hand. Lord Sherborne. I shall. I have laid out the Derbyshire italic at the South Library since my great-aunt's hand came down at the will at the 8th of January, and I have read the small section diagram at page 19 of the Sherborne quarto at your own fair Cambridge hand these 15 Tuesdays, and I have walked the home pasture at the Gentle Peak district evening these 12 Wednesdays, and the small sprig of Derbyshire wild thyme you laid at my hand at the dry stone wall at the quiet Derbyshire silence on Wednesday the 7th of June stands at the linen pouch at the geology pencil cleaning cloth at the South Library second drawer at the Gentle Parsonage italic. I shall. Lord Sherborne took her ungloved hand at the round mahogany table at the small fair Derbyshire, second of 3. Miss Harcourt. I shall ride at the Reverend Hadrian Harcourt at the Bakewell Parsonage at 6 this evening, with your fair leave. I shall ride at Mr. Bakewell Smith at the Friargate Chambers at the Monday following at Derby. The banns shall be read at St. Mary's of Harcourt by Bakewell at the Sunday of the 13th, and at the Sunday of the 20th, and at the Sunday of the 27th of August at the parish church. The matter shall stand at the Derbyshire Register. Lady Adelaide came in at the South Library door at the small Derbyshire 3:minute, at her own quiet reading hour pace at the gravel sweep, the peach silk ribbons at the plait, the warm hazel eyes plain at the round mahogany table, and stopped at the threshold at the fair Derbyshire afternoon gold at the south sash. Papa, has Miss Harcourt said yes at the South Library? Lady Adelaide, Miss Harcourt has said yes at the South Library at the round mahogany table. Then the Blue John plate at the 4th drawer of the walnut cabinet at Mamma's South Library shall be laid out at the Lady Day, following at the Gentle Harcourt italic, and I shall help at the Sherborne Park Parish School, Saturday at the fair 6-girl class at the Upper Derwent Valley. Caroline laid her ungloved hand at Lady Adelaide's small hazel-eyed head at the South Library threshold at the quiet Derbyshire minute. Lady Adelaide, you shall help at the Blue John plate at the 4th drawer, and at the Sherborne Park Parish School Saturday class. The matter shall stand at the Sherborne Park Lady Day. The Reverend Tideswell read the banns of marriage between Lord Marmaduke Aubrey Sherborne, 5th Viscount Sherborne of Sherborne Park, and Miss Caroline Mary Harcourt of Harcourt Hall, at St. Mary's of Harcourt by Bakewell, at morning prayer on Sunday the 13th, Sunday the 20th, and Sunday the 27th of August at the small Derbyshire chime of 10. No impediment laid out at the parish gate at any Sunday of 3. The parish clerk, Mr. Hadfield Bakewell, entering the matter at the parish register at the second column in plain black ink. On Saturday the 9th of September, 1820 at 10 at the small Derbyshire chime, the parish church of St. Mary's of Harcourt by Bakewell stood at the gentle fair Derbyshire morning at the late hawthorn at the churchyard wall, the home pasture beyond the south meadow at the fresh September short grass, the Wye at the south fields at the fair low flow of the early autumn quarter at the Peak District country. Mrs. Worksworth, the village dressmaker, had laid out the bride's gown at the Harcourt south parlour at the Friday evening, cream Derbyshire muslin morning gown at the fair Peak District cut, the small sprig of late summer Derbyshire wild thyme at the bodice, with one white and cream rose at the south orangery, the Harcourt pearls in the Derby setting of 1789 at the throat, the ivory silk gloves at the wrists, and at the inner pocket of the cream muslin at her own quiet hand, Caroline had laid the small silver locket of her late mother, Mrs. Sarah Eddingham Harcourt, that had stood at the Bakewell parsonage second drawer these 22 years past. Mr. Bakewell Smith, in plain dark wool and his gold spectacles, handed Caroline at the south gravel sweep, and walked her at the gentle Derbyshire pace at the south porch of St. Mary's. The Reverend Hadrian Harcourt, her father, took the front pew at the fair morning at the small Derbyshire chime. Lady Adelaide, at the second pew in soft peach muslin and peach ribbons, sat at her grandmother, the Dowager Lady Sherborne, at the plum and grey bombazine. Lady Honoria, Sherborne Sandys and Mr. Quentin Sandys took the third pew at the creamstock and primrose waistcoat. Lady Frances Sherborne Sandys and Mr. Hubert Sandys took the fourth, and Lady Constance Sherborne Sandys and Mr. Aldous Sandys the fifth. Mrs. Castleton at the housekeeper's keys, Mr. Edale at the home pasture, Mr. Buxton at the south door, and Miss Damaris Castleton at the reading companion's chair, took the parish gallery at the gentle Derbyshire fashion the late Mrs. Theodora Harcourt had kept all her days at the upper Wye Valley. The Reverend Tideswell, in plain black gown, read the solemnization at the small Derbyshire chime of 10 at the gentle fair September morning. Mr. Bakewell Smith gave the bride away at the gentle Derbyshire pace at the chancel step. Lord Sherborne, at the chancel rail in plain dark blue morning coat and cream waistcoat, laid the Derby gold ring at Caroline's ungloved fourth finger at the gentle Derbyshire second, and the parish register at the vestry table was signed at Lord Sherborne's hand, and at Caroline's hand, and at Mr. Bakewell Smith's hand, and at the Reverend Hadrian Harcourt's hand, in the Reverend Tideswell's quiet Derbyshire italic, at the fair morning of the 9th of September, 1820. The wedding breakfast was laid out at the south dining room at Harcourt Hall, at noon at the gentle Derbyshire fashion, plain cold ham and Derbyshire pheasant, and the seed cake the late Mrs. Theodora Harcourt had kept at the Lady Day calls these 30 years past. Fresh Wye Valley butter at the small Derby dish, Bakewell pudding at the cream plate, and the late hothouse peaches at the cut-glass stand from the Sherborne Park kitchen garden. The Derby service of 1789 stood at the long mahogany table, the home pasture at the south sash at the fresh September short grass, the Wye at the south fields at the fair low flow. The Reverend Hadrian Harcourt spoke a brief Derbyshire grace at the head of the table at noon. The Dowager Lady Sherborne answered the Amen at her quiet voice at the second chair. Lady Adelaide at the third chair held her grandmother's hand at the seed cake plate. The Dowager Lady Sherborne laid her quiet hand at the new Lady Sherborne's at the south dining-room door at 1:30, and the Cambridge chariot took Lord Sherborne and his bride at the gentle Derbyshire pace at the upper Derwent Valley at the fair September afternoon, to Sherborne Park at the 4 o'clock chime of the long parish day. If you have stayed with me to the close of this story, I should be glad of one small word from you in the comments below. Tell me the county or the country you are listening from this evening, and one quiet kindness you have lately received that you have not yet had the chance to repay. If this story has been a comfort to your hour, do press the small bell beside the subscribe ribbon at this channel, so that the next Whispers of Love story shall find you in its turn. Until then, be at your ease, and at your candle, and at your hour. Whispers of Love. Mr. Edale continued at the home pasture. Mrs. Castleton continued at the housekeeper's keys. The quarter-day audit went forward at Michaelmas. Miss Damaris Castleton continued at the South Library, evenings with the rock cabinet at her hand. Outside, the Derbyshire Peak District sky turned the colour of slate after rain at the close of the September day, and the Derbyshire Y ran the colour of pewter at the South Meadow. So Miss Caroline Harcourt, who had sat in gentle Derbyshire silence at the south parlour window of the Bakewell parsonage on the soft Wednesday morning of the 22nd of December, and finished the Carboniferous Brachiopod cataloguing at her Greencalf Geology Journal, became, by the patient asking of the 5th Viscount Sherborne, the 7th Lady Sherborne of Sherborne Park, in the gentle Derbyshire fashion her own late mother, Mrs. Sarah Edingham Harcourt, had kept all her days.